Right, well, today I'm joined by Professor Brad Jackson, who's from the University of Auckland Business School in New Zealand. And Brad's been giving a lunchtime seminar today about a topic of research that he's been pursuing into the geography of leadership. And I just wondered if you'd like to speak a little bit about where that idea came from, the idea of the geography of leadership.
Well, thank you, Donna. Two places, really. When you look at definitions of leadership, and there are literally thousands of definitions of leadership, there is generally some acknowledgement about context, that leadership has to take place in a context, and actually context shapes leadership processes. But when you start to drill down into the research, it's funny, it's not, no one's ever really sits down and says, well, what do we mean by context, and how does it actually influence? It's just so it's one of those people that acknowledge it's important, but they won't necessarily focus on that. They'll focus on leadership or leader characteristics, follower characteristics, or mission or purpose or whatever. So that was curious to me, being a leadership scholar. But the other part was the fact that I've been in New Zealand for the past 10 years, and certainly my encounter specifically with Maori leaders and the challenges that they face in terms of creating business. Competitive business in a global context is how critical place is to their whole philosophy of leadership and their whole engagement with the followers, etc. Which is something that I suppose, being what we would call Pākehā, in other words of European descent, is the place is different. It's less focused in terms of leadership practices. So. Basically, a combination of going to literature, realizing that context wasn't being problematized, and being in a country where we are quite remote from the rest of the world, and as it's quite a distinctive environment with its challenges, but particularly engaged with Maori, basically said, you know what, we have to theorize the role of place and understanding the role of place in terms of contributing and shaping leadership.
Yeah. It's really interesting to think about the ways that actually might help us think about leadership. I mean, do you have any examples of ways in which you think this might expand how we think about leadership?
Well, it's interesting that if you look at the work that's being done on leadership research and the work that's being done on sustainability, in environmental, and the extent to which they are two separate lines of debate, of research. The sustainability research is focusing very much on environmental conditions, but I think maybe a little weaker in terms of understanding the dynamics of persuasion, of influence, of trying to mobilize disparate groups around this sustainability cause. Whereas leadership, funny enough, has sort of has acknowledged the environment as a key issue, but it's sort of try to keep this kind of, well, there are these generic processes and they can be used anywhere, basically. And so I sense that might be a powerful area where, both areas could actually be mutually enriched by taking a more of a place-based perspective on leadership.
I mean, you mentioned in the seminar how, in many ways, this line of research is quite sort of counter to our preoccupation in business schools, for instance, to sort of sanitize business education so we can kind of place it anywhere. I mean, do you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, and it's interesting because I've mentioned the course I'm teaching, the Copenhagen Business School on, it's called the geography of leadership in the urban context, and the students are finding it quite interesting because we're saying, difference matters, place is something that is not only something you've got to deal with, it's actually something you should celebrate and actually engage with, and you should be willing to shape and change your practice based on your experience. And that's, they want to know which model to use, which will be the right model, and this notion of being able to develop a more agile, more contextualized approach to leadership, I think is quite counter to the way a lot of the business schools have been saying, part of our mandate is to create, an international cadet force of global leaders who have been trained pretty well in very similar materials, have the same language, etc., in a way to almost conquer place and conquer space through technology, information technology, etc., through business models, etc. So in some respects, we're doing a lot to, defeat and overcome place. But I think if, that's a very select, partial view of the world. I mean, and I think we have to keep reminding ourselves that there are many others who are very much rooted in their parents and their grandparents, etc. You know, there's one place that's central to them, and it's a critical part of who they are.
Yeah.
So it's important, I think, to counterbalance that.
Right.
And who makes the decisions about, you know, what places there will be, and you know, the dominant understandings of. There's some really serious, I think, ethical, moral, but also, you know, business implications about taking that homogenized view of place, or placeless view of business.
Yeah. Great. Thank you very much. It's been a very stimulating seminar today, and I'll be interested to see how your work develops.
Well, thank you, and thank you for giving me the chance to finally discover what was supposed to be a placeless place. That's Milton Keynes, but in actual fact, I found it's a very distinctive and a very compelling place. So thank you, Donna.
Thank you.